Get out of here. This place isn't for the likes of you, you little vagrant. Go away. Humiliated, chased away from the supermarket just for selling banh mi, but the poor boy of that year silently vowed that one day, this whole city would know his name. Will, only 12 years old, lived a life that others would find heartbreaking just hearing about it. Orphaned at a young age, he and his mother relied on each other in a rundown apartment, precariously situated among the brightly lit streets of the city. Every day for Will began before dawn, with his small feet padding along the uneven road, pushing his old banh mi cart. The bustling neighborhoods he passed through were ablaze with lights. But they never seemed to illuminate his life. There, Will was just a silent shadow, a boy that people didn't bother to notice. The banh mi cart was not only his livelihood but also his only hope for his ailing mother, who was bedridden. Every time he saw her in pain, Will would tell himself that he couldn't give up, as long as he sold all the banh mi today. He would have enough money to buy more medicine for his mother. But life isn't always kind to the poor. On rainy days, he had to huddle under a thin raincoat, shielding the loaves of bread from getting wet. On slow days, he would go hungry and thirsty to save every penny for his mother. There were times when he was chased away, looked down upon, but Will's eyes never stopped searching for a glimmer of hope in the countless indifferent eyes around him. Will didn't resent his fate, nor did he envy the children his age who got to go to school. He only wished that one day, his mother would get better, and he could give her a full meal. But fate seemed to test him even more, as the warm rays of life's sunshine remained forever out of his reach. If you enjoy this story, don't forget subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the amazing story tomorrow. That day, Will stopped his old banh mi cart in front of a large supermarket. The bright lights and the flow of people coming and going made him feel incredibly small. Will knew this place wasn't like the street markets where he usually sold, but today, the remaining money wasn't enough to buy medicine for his mother. He had no choice but to try his luck here. Fresh, hot banh mi here, only £2 each. The boy's voice rang out weakly amidst the city's noise. Despite his best efforts to call out, no one stopped to listen. Will watched the well-dressed people walk past him, his eyes full of hope but also gradually becoming anxious. A customer just stepped out of the supermarket with bags in hand, and Will quickly approached. "Excuse me, madam, would you like to buy a banh mi? It's only £2. But before the woman could answer, from inside the supermarket, a burly figure appeared. It was Mr. Jones, the supermarket's head of security, with a cold face and unpleasant eyes. He looked at Will as if he had just committed a major crime. "Hey, kid, what are you doing here? Who gave you permission to stand in front of the supermarket?" Mr. Jones's voice boomed authoritatively, making Will flinch and step back. Will quickly replied, I'm just selling banh mi, I'm not doing anything wrong, sir." But Mr. Jones didn't let Will finish his sentence. He stepped forward, forcefully pushing the banh mi cart, causing it to tip over. The loaves of bread fell to the ground, scattered on the white tiles of the supermarket. Will quickly knelt down, picking up each loaf, his hands trembling as he tried to brush off the dirt. "Please, sir, I need the money to buy medicine for my mum, I'll just stand here for a bit, please don't chase me away." The boy's voice choked with sobs, tears mixing with the sweat on his grimy face. But Mr. Jones just coldly shouted, "Get out of here. This place isn't for the likes of you, you little vagrant. Go away." Will tried to hold back his tears. He bowed his head, pulling the cart towards the curb. Around him, customers looked at him with cold eyes, no one bothered to stop and help. To them, the poor boy was just a minor disturbance in their busy day. Will looked down at the now dirty loaves of banh mi, his heart clenching, but in his eyes, a light of determination still flickered. "One day, I won't have to endure this anymore," he told himself, then quietly walked away, pulling the nearly empty banh mi cart. Will trudged along, pulling the banh mi cart to a corner of the sidewalk far from the supermarket. his heart heavy. The loaves he had just picked up were soiled, no one would want to buy them. He lowered his head, tears streaming down his face, but his feet kept moving, because he knew that stopping meant his mother wouldn't have medicine. As Will was about to leave, a middle-aged woman stepped out of the supermarket. It was Mrs. Smith, elegant in appearance but with warm eyes. She had witnessed everything from afar and couldn't help but feel sorry for the little boy who had been humiliated. She approached him, speaking in a gentle voice. "Son, how many banh mi do you have left? I'll buy them all." Will looked up, his eyes still red. He stammered. "Ma'am, but my banh mi are dirty, I can't sell them." Mrs. Smith replied softly. "It's okay, I'm not buying them because of the bread, but because you deserve to be helped." Not only did she buy all the banh mi, but she also placed a bill in Will's hand that was much larger than the cost of the bread. He widened his eyes, bewildered, and said, "I can't accept this much." Mrs. Smith smiled, interrupting him. "Take it, it's a reward for your hard work. But remember, hard work alone isn't enough. You must have faith and dreams. One day, you'll do something greater." Will choked back tears, accepting the money, bowing his head in gratitude repeatedly. For the first time in a long, unfair day, he felt the warmth of human kindness. As Mrs. Smith's figure faded into the crowd, Will looked back at the empty banh mi cart, but his heart felt full of hope. He promised himself that Mrs. Smith's words would be the motivation for him to keep going, even though the road ahead was still full of difficulties. In the days following his encounter with Mrs. Smith, Will felt as if he had found a small ray of light in the midst of a dark night. Mrs. Smith's words echoed in his mind every time he pushed the banh mi cart through the crowded streets. "You must have faith and dreams." Will began to believe that, with enough effort, things could change. However, life seemed unwilling to give him time to hope for long. One morning, when Will returned home after a day of selling banh mi, he found his mother lying in bed, her breathing more labored than usual. She tried to give him a weak smile, but Will immediately realized that she was hiding the pain in her chest. "Mom, let me take you to the clinic," Will said anxiously, but she just shook her head. "Where will we get the money for a checkup, son?" Will looked around the empty house. The money Mrs. Smith had given him had almost been used up to buy medicine in the previous days. In his heart, a wave of worry surged, but he quickly suppressed it. He couldn't lose his mother, the only family he had left in his life. The next day, Will decided to double his efforts. He not only sold banh mi but also took on other odd jobs, cleaning shops, washing dishes, even helping out at small stalls. Will didn't refuse any work as long as he could earn money. His small hands became calloused. But he never complained. Sometimes, when pushing the banh mi cart past the supermarket where he had been chased away, Will would stop for a moment. He didn't dare to enter, but his eyes would look up at the brightly lit sign above. In his heart, he silently vowed, "One day, I will enter this place, not with empty hands, but in a different position." But Will's efforts weren't fast enough to outpace time. One night, his mother's condition worsened, this time even more critically. Will stayed awake all night, sitting by her bedside, holding her frail hand tightly. The light from the oil lamp cast shadows on his face, filled with worry and helplessness. That whole night, Will couldn't sleep. He silently blamed himself for not earning enough money, silently blamed fate for being so unfair to him and his mother. But the next morning, as the sun began to rise, he got up again, continuing his journey to make a living. Will was more determined than ever. He no longer thought only about today, but started dreaming of a more distant future, where he wouldn't have to fear illness, poverty, or the scornful looks of others. He believed that, if he didn't stop, things would change. One morning, as the sun rose, Will pushed his banh mi cart through the bustling eastern market. The days of relentless work had made his hands even more calloused. But his eyes remained as resolute as the first day. In Will's heart, the image of his mother remained the greatest motivation for him to keep going. At the corner of the market, Will stopped near an old pizza shop, where people often came to buy delicious slices in the morning. The owner was Mr. Baker, a man in his 50s. With a simple appearance but sharp eyes. He stood in front of the counter, observing the flow of people passing by. Will hesitantly approached, speaking in a small voice. "Excuse me, sir, I sell banh mi here. Would you like to buy one from me?" Mr. Baker turned around, looking at Will for a long moment. Instead of answering, he asked, "Where do you make these banh mi?" Will replied, flustered. "Sir, I buy them from a small bakery. I'm just selling them to earn money to support my mother." Noticing Will's honesty and hard-working appearance, Mr. Baker didn't answer immediately. After a moment of thought, he suddenly asked, "If I taught you how to make pizza, would you want to learn?" Will's eyes widened, unable to believe his ears. "Really, sir? But He stammered, because he knew he couldn't leave his banh mi cart to learn a trade without earning money immediately. Mr. Baker seemed to understand the hesitation in Will's heart. He smiled gently and said, "I don't need you to learn for free. You can help me in the shop, work and learn at the same time. I'll pay you enough to take care of your mother." For Will, this was an unprecedented opportunity. Since childhood, he had only known simple labor, but this was a chance for him to learn a real skill. Without thinking for long, he nodded in agreement. From that day on, Will started working at Mr. Baker's pizza shop. In the morning, he helped sell, cleaned the shop, and arranged ingredients. In the afternoon, when the customers had thinned out, Mr. Baker began to teach him the basic techniques, how to knead dough, control the oven, and select ingredients. Will was not only hardworking but also proved to be very quick and intelligent. He listened to every instruction from Mr. Baker, memorizing every small detail. Sometimes, Mr. Baker even taught him things that weren't part of pizza making, like how to calculate costs and how to serve customers with dedication. A pizza shop is not just a place to sell food, but a place to bring joy to customers, Mr. Baker once told him. Those words etched themselves deep into Will's mind, opening up new thoughts about the future. He wasn't just learning to make a living day by day, but started dreaming of opening his own pizza shop. From the initial hard-working days, Will now carried within him a greater desire than ever before. He also started incorporating the making of banh mi into the pizzeria's daily routine. He would prepare the ingredients and make some of the sandwiches to offer to the customers. At the shop, Will met Aisha, a friendly girl who also worked part-time. Aisha, being of similar age and also from an immigrant background, quickly befriended Will. She helped him navigate the sometimes confusing social cues of their peers and boosted his confidence in speaking English. They shared stories of their families, their dreams, and the challenges they faced, creating a bond that went beyond the workplace. Aisha taught Will some slang and helped him understand British pop culture, while Will shared stories of Vietnam and the delicious food his mother made. 10 years passed. Will was now a grown man. No longer the poor banh mi boy of the past. In a well-tailored suit, his eyes confident, Will entered a large conference room. On the table, the logo of the supermarket chain, Wilmart, was clearly visible, representing one of the largest retail systems in the city. Looking back on his journey, Will couldn't help but be moved. After the days of learning under Mr. Baker's guidance, Will not only learned how to make pizza and banh mi but also gained a deep understanding of how to manage and operate a business. When Mr. Baker's pizza shop faced difficulties, it was Will who helped find solutions, from changing the business strategy to promoting the products, bringing in stable revenue. The combination of banh mi with pizza, becoming Pizza Banh Mi, was a huge success. Will didn't stop at just making pizza and sandwiches. With the small capital he had accumulated and moral support from Mr. Baker and Aisha, he started his first store, a small grocery store specializing in clean food. Thanks to his reputation and dedicated service, the store became increasingly crowded. Step by step, Will opened more branches, and the name, Wilmart, gradually became a familiar brand to the people in the city. Despite achieving great success, Will never forgot his difficult days. He often reminded himself that he had once stood at the bottom of society. And it was his hard work, faith, and the people who helped him that brought him here. Wilmart wasn't like other supermarkets. Here, no one was rejected or looked down upon just because they were poor. Low-income workers could buy goods at discounted prices, and there were even charity programs to help them. Will believed that success wasn't just to serve oneself, but also a way to repay life. In his spacious office, Will opened a small wooden cabinet, taking out an old, worn-out memento, the wooden sign from his banh mi cart from years ago. On it, the words, "Fresh, hot banh mi, only £2," had faded with time. Will smiled softly, remembering the days of standing in the rain selling banh mi. The times he was chased away from the supermarket, and the encouraging eyes of Mrs. Smith. But most of all, Will remembered his mother, who had passed away a few years earlier. It was the image of her lying in her sickbed, giving him a weak but encouraging smile, that had become the source of strength for Will to never give up. Will stood up, straightened his tie, and looked out the large glass window. The city below was still as bustling as ever, but to him, everything had changed. Will was no longer the boy who was looked down upon, he was a successful businessman who had turned the hardships of his past into the motivation to change the future. Will stepped down from his sleek black car, his face calm but his eyes filled with contemplation. In front of him stood the supermarket where, 10 years ago, a poor boy had been roughly turned away just for trying to sell banh mi to earn money for his mother's medicine. All those painful memories came flooding back, but now, Will had returned in a completely different position. After years of success with the Wilmart chain, Will decided to buy this old supermarket, not only for its commercial value but also for its personal significance. He wanted to transform the place that had once hurt him into a symbol of change and compassion. Today, the newly named Wilmart Center was holding its grand opening. Outside, a large banner was hung with the words, "Welcoming everyone, regardless of wealth or status." That simple message made the working-class people in the area feel respected and welcome, something they had never thought possible before. Will walked inside, where every corner, every aisle, had been completely transformed. Gone were the cold lighting and the distant atmosphere, the supermarket was now filled with laughter and warmth. The shelves were neatly arranged and clean, but not overly ostentatious. The staff warmly greeted customers, without any discrimination or disdain, regardless of whether they bought a lot or a little. Will walked to a small corner near the entrance, the place where he had once been pushed, his banh mi cart overturned. He stopped, his eyes momentarily clouded with thought. Perhaps for many people, this was just an ordinary moment, but for Will, this was the place that marked a turning point in his life. Not long after, a staff member approached Will, whispering, "Everything is ready, sir." Will nodded, stepping onto a small stage set up in the middle of the supermarket lobby. The lights shone brightly, hundreds of local residents had gathered to await the opening moment. Will held the microphone, his eyes scanning the crowd before him. He recognized some familiar faces from the old days, people who had once looked at him with indifference, or silently turned away when he was humiliated. But instead of resentment, Will simply smiled. "Welcome, everyone, to Wilmart Center. This is not just a supermarket, it is a place for everyone, regardless of who is rich or poor. 10 years ago, I stood in front of this place, with empty hands and the eyes of a banh mi boy. And today, I return here not to recount the pain, but to share a story of hope, perseverance, and kindness." Will's words echoed through the space, the listeners couldn't help but be moved. Some of the low-income workers in the crowd nodded, their eyes shining with pride and gratitude. As applause erupted throughout the hall, Will smiled and stepped off the stage. Standing in a secluded corner, he quietly watched the streams of people entering and leaving the supermarket, no longer seeing in different eyes, no longer feeling the coldness. Will felt that, finally, he had turned a painful memory into a lesson and instilled in this place a higher value. The second day after the grand opening, Will returned to Wilmart Center to check on the supermarket's operations. As he entered the management office, he heard a soft knock on the door. A staff member entered, speaking in a hushed tone. "Sir, there's an elderly gentleman asking to see you. He's waiting at the reception desk." Will curiously walked out to the front lobby. From afar, he saw a middle-aged man with a thin frame, slightly hunched shoulders, and a face full of wrinkles. His hands clutched an old hat, his eyes hesitantly looking around as if waiting for something. Will was stunned. Although time had passed, he instantly recognized Mr. Jones, the security guard who had chased him away from the supermarket years ago. But Mr. Jones now lacked the sternness or authority he once possessed. His face showed fatigue, worry, and a hint of embarrassment. When Mr. Jones saw Will, he quickly stood up, bowing his head and saying, Hello, sir, I heard this supermarket is hiring security guards. I'm old, but I can still do light work. Please, sir, give me a chance." Will remained silent for a long moment, his gaze unreadable. The old memories flooded back, the scene of Mr. Jones knocking over his banh mi cart, the loaves scattered on the ground, and the harsh words of that year. But Will didn't let his emotions take over. He looked at Mr. Jones, the man now thin and weak, lacking any of his former power. After a moment, Will spoke softly. "Please, come in. Let's sit down and talk for a bit." Inside the office, Will listened to Mr. Jones's story. It turned out that after leaving his job at the old supermarket, Mr. Jones had faced difficulties in his life. His family was not harmonious, his health had deteriorated, and his age made it difficult for him to find work. Mr. Jones's words were sincere, his eyes full of pleading. Will silently nodded. He called in the staff member in charge of personnel, arranging for Mr. Jones a suitable security guard position. Not only that, he also added, "Please help Mr. Jones find temporary accommodation in the staff housing area." When everything was done, Mr. Jones stood up, bowing his head repeatedly in gratitude. But before leaving, he turned back to look at Will, his eyes hesitant. "Mr. Owner, it seems like we've met somewhere before, haven't we?" Will just smiled, not answering. He didn't want to bring up the old story, not because he had forgotten, but because he knew that forgiveness was the best way to close a painful past. That evening, Will stood on the stage in the main hall of Wilmart Center. Around him, hundreds of residents, staff, and even former customers of the supermarket were present. The light from the ceiling lamps shone down, but it was Will's story that truly captured everyone's attention. Will began in a calm but emotional voice. 10 years ago, I stood in front of this supermarket, not as an owner, but as a poor boy selling banh mi. At that time, I only hoped to earn enough money to buy medicine for my mother, but what I received was contempt and pain. Today, I return here not to hold a grudge, but to tell everyone that, in the greatest difficulties of life, perseverance and faith can change everything. Everyone listened quietly. Some people bowed their heads, as if reflecting on their past mistakes in how they treated those less fortunate. Will continued. Success does not come from a single individual. I received kindness from people I never expected, like Mrs. Smith, who helped me when I was desperate. It was those things that taught me that we don't just live for ourselves, but also to spread kindness. A round of applause erupted, but Will hadn't finished. He smiled softly and added, "I want to dedicate this supermarket to everyone, those who have been rejected, those who have felt they have no place. Here, no one is discriminated against. No matter who you are, you will be welcomed." Will's final words were like a message. If you are facing difficulties, believe in yourself. Every road has light, as long as you don't give up. And if you can, help others when they need it. Because sometimes, a small act of yours can change an entire life. After the speech, prolonged applause echoed throughout the hall. Will stepped down from the stage, mingling with the crowd. No longer any distance, no longer any separation between him and his customers. The story ends with an image of Will standing in front of Wilmart Center, looking up at the sky with a contented smile. For him, the past was not just pain, but also the motivation to build a meaningful future.